Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Josh Redstone and I'm back with another video lecture for Phil 1301A, Mind, World, and Knowledge. And this is the last full lecture of the term that I'll be delivering. And it is all about the mind, or more specifically, how we started thinking about the mind and trying to study the mind in the 20th century. So we've talked a little bit about how different thinkers from different periods in history and places around the world have understood the mind in this class. For example, we've talked about Plato's tripartite soul, where we have a rational soul, which would be the mind, together with an appetitive soul and a spirited soul. We've talked a little bit about Descartes, who talked about the mind as a thinking thing, and indeed, when we discuss the rationalist and empiricist philosophers, that's probably where we spent the most time talking about the mind. In the modern period and forward through the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, and through that period in history, the mind was still understood on the one hand to be basically the soul. For example, Descartes thought that we were basically these intricate machines that were controlled by a soul. Or we were, or you know, you could talk about a thinker like Thomas Hobbes, who was more materialistic than Descartes and who would have said, well, we're just machines. So Descartes, where he would have advocated something like what Gilbert Ryle would later call the dogma of the ghost in the machine. For Hobbes, there is no ghost in the machine, just the machine. Now, of course, this is not a comprehensive survey, but it's some of the ways that we've talked about the mind so far. But I wanted to talk about the mind as it's come to be understood in the 20th century because, well, for one reason, we haven't had all that much time to talk about the mind, except in a sort of peripheral sense in this class, and I think that's a shame because this class is Mind, World, and Knowledge after all. The book certainly doesn't cover very much about the modern understanding of the mind, but you know, that's another reason why I think it would be interesting to talk about. Not just that it's not covered to very much to any great extent in the book, but also because I am a cognitive scientist by training. What that means is that I'm somebody who uses an interdisciplinary approach to understand the mind, or minds, and the mental. So this is probably the area of this class where I'm most suited or most qualified to talk about. So with that said, I want to start around the beginning of the 20th century, and we'll take a look at all of these disparate areas of research that were asking similar questions about the mind. And we'll gradually move forward in history until we get to the beginning of what is called the cognitive revolution. So let's get started. So before we get started, I should mention that the materials I'm drawing on for this lecture come from this book right here, Cognitive Science, An Introduction to the Science of the Mind by Jose Luis Bermudez. This is a book that I usually use when I teach my Introduction to Cognitive Science class. It's a great book. But of course, I understand that you will not have access to it. So don't worry about there being any required readings for this lecture. If I'm able to, I will try and make if I can find an online version of this that's free to access, I will make it available in case any of you are interested in reading it. But all of the material from this lecture that you will be tested on in the final exam, it just comes from what I will communicate to you in the lecture. So if you're not able to access this, it's no big deal. You'll be able to follow the lecture without the text. All right, so let's get started with behaviorism. So the first area that we're going to look at today was a movement in psychology called behaviorism. And according to behaviorism, psychology is, or ought to be, the science of behavior. Not the science of the mind, or the psyche, but of behavior. Why was that? Why would behaviorists frame psychology as the study of behavior and not the study of the mind. That sounds pretty weird to somebody who might be a bit more familiar with psychology as the study of the mind. Well, behaviorism was started by John B. Watson, and its most famous advocate was arguably B.F. Skinner. And both of these thinkers were responsible for, I guess, leading the charge of behaviorism during the early 20th century. As to why they thought that psychology ought to be focused on behavior and not the mind, well, behaviorist psychologists felt that psychologists couldn't actually study the mind or mental states because mental states are not observable the way that behavior is. So somebody like Skinner or Watson thought that psychologists were better equipped to study behavior because we can link particular stimuli with particular behavioral responses. And if we can understand those chains of stimulus and response, we can understand behavior. But we can't look inside the mind and study mental states. In other words, on behaviorism, the mind is treated as what sometimes is called a black box. We can't look inside of a black box. It's mysterious. Whatever's going on in the black box of the mind is mysterious and we can't observe it. And what we can't observe, we cannot do science with, right? To do science, we need to be able to observe things. It's the first step in the scientific method, right? So observation is important, and we cannot study unobservable mental states. And this is really where everything begins for cognitive science and the modern understanding of the mind, is this idea that, or rather the question of whether we can study mental states, or indeed the mental in general. So, what psychologists like Watson and Skinner thought we ought to do instead was try to understand non-psychological mechanisms that link certain stimuli with certain kinds of behavior. And all behaviorists, or pretty much most behaviorists, believed that all of these mechanisms are the product of something called conditioning. You've probably heard of conditioning before. Think here of the well-known example of Pavlov's dogs, right? Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist, and he and his lab assistants would go in and feed the dogs that they would use in their laboratory for studying behavior. And there was a bell on the door to where they kept the dogs, so that every time the human came in to feed the dogs, the bell would ring, and eventually the dogs associated the ringing of the bell with getting food, so that even when food wasn't present, upon hearing the bell ring, the dogs would still salivate. That's conditioning. And according to behaviorism, all learning is the product of conditioning. And conditioning depends upon association and reinforcement. So, one example of conditioning that's often cited is something called operant conditioning. And operant conditioning is what happens in something like a Skinner box, which I'll show you here. Skinner boxes, of course, invented by B.F. Skinner, to teach animals certain behaviors via operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is when we use positive or negative reinforcement to get some animal or even a person to learn how to do a behavior voluntarily. These are often behaviors that animals just wouldn't do in nature. For example, pushing buttons and pulling levers. That's not something we see in classical conditioning, which I'll talk about in a moment. But here a rat might learn to press a certain button to receive a reward, and receive no reward for pressing a different button, or receive a shock for pressing the wrong button. Right, that's operant conditioning. All of this is also sometimes called reinforcement learning. So we have types of conditioning like operant conditioning, and that's an example of reinforcement learning, where the kind of behavior you want is reinforced with some kind of positive or negative feedback. Of course, a lot of behaviorists also studied a simpler form of conditioning, and that's classical conditioning. Classical conditioning includes examples like Pavlov's dogs, which I mentioned a moment ago. On classical conditioning, what you have is an association between a neutral conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, which provokes a certain behavioral response. So let's go back to Pavlov's dogs, right? We have a particular behavioral response, salivation, right? When the dogs smell their food, they salivate. So that's the response, salivation. And the food is the unconditioned stimulus, right? We haven't conditioned the dogs to salivate just by giving them food. The dog will do that anyway. If we show it some food, it'll start to salivate, right? The conditioned stimulus is the bell ringing. And we say that it's neutral because on its own, hearing a bell ring is not going to trigger any particular kind of behavior in the dog. But we can create an association between the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus such that when the association becomes strong enough, thanks to reinforcement, the particular response that we're interested in will occur with the conditioned stimulus in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. So eventually this learned association becomes so strong that we can ring a bell and the dog will salivate even if there's no food present. So that's classical conditioning. Now, the demise of behaviorism actually began from within behaviorism itself. It occurred thanks to a behaviorist psychologist named Edward Tolman and some of his students and colleagues. They conducted some what are pretty famous experiments by now with rats. Now, Tolman and his colleagues were interested in things like learning and problem solving in animals, but from a behaviorist perspective. So remember, they weren't looking to study mental states, but just linked chains of stimulus and response. But their experimental results ended up casting significant doubt on some of the principles of behaviorism that we've just discussed. So for example, in one of their experiments, Tolman and Hosnick, and this is a study done in the 1930s, trained 3 different groups of rats to run what's called a T-alley maze. So here's a T-alley maze here. So we have these 3 groups of rats. One group of rats was rewarded every time they successfully ran the maze. So they'd be given a little bit of food or something every time they made it to the end of the maze. The second group of rats was never rewarded. And the third group of rats began to receive rewards when they successfully completed the maze, but only after 10 days of training. So what happened here? What were the results? Well, as Tolman and his colleagues predicted, the first group of rats, the group that was rewarded upon successful completion of the maze, seemed to learn to run the maze quicker than the other 2 groups. Indeed, the other 2 groups just kind of wandered aimlessly around the maze. However, after the third group, which was the one that began to receive rewards after 10 days, after they began receiving rewards, it turns out that they would run the maze faster or figure out how to run the maze in less time once they began receiving rewards than the first group had. So what was going on here? Well, Tolman and Hosnick reasoned that the rats in the third group must have been learning the layout of the maze while they were aimlessly wandering around. In other words, they must have been learning the layout of the maze without reinforcement. So that's learning without conditioning, and that violates a pretty big principle in behaviorism, that all learning is the product of conditioning, which is association and reinforcement. And Tolman called this kind of learning latent learning. They were learning the layout of the maze without being rewarded or punished for doing so. They were just making, I guess what we could call a mental map of the maze as they were aimlessly wandering around. And then they were able to use that information to navigate to the maze once they began receiving rewards for completing the maze. So this is the kind of thing that behaviorist psychologists could not account for with the principles of behaviorism alone. So, it seemed to Tolman and his colleagues that these rats were capable of storing information about the environment and using it later without any kind of reinforcement. But that led them to ask, what kind of information is being stored? What kind of information are these rats keeping in their little rat brains? Well, Tolman and some of his students decided to investigate this possibility, so they did another experiment with a different kind of maze called a cross maze. I'll place an image here in a moment. They had two experimental conditions in this study. One was a place learning condition, to see whether the rats were storing information about the spatial properties of the maze, and the other was a response learning condition, to see whether the rats were storing information about the sequences of movements that they used to navigate the maze. So here you can see not a T-alley maze, a cross maze. And Tolman and his colleagues Ritchie and Kalish in 1946 reported the results of this experiment, and it suggested that what rats are doing is place learning rather than response learning. So they had two groups of rats, as I mentioned, and they were trained to find a reward in this simple cross maze here. Now each group of rats alternated between starting at the north and south ends of the maze. But one group of rats, the reward for them always stayed in the same place, say the eastern part of the cross maze. So depending on where the food was, the rats would have to make either a right or a left turn, depending on whether they started at the north end or the south end. So in this trial, the same turning response would not guarantee that the rat reached the reward, because the rats alternated, starting north, starting south. If you start on one end, you have to make a different turn than if you start on the other end, right, to reach the food. In the second group, the rewards location was alternated so that regardless of the rat's starting point, the same turning response would always take the rat to where the reward was located. So group 1 was obviously the place learning condition, and group 2 was the response learning condition. So what happened? Well, the first group of rats, the place learning condition, they learned to find the reward faster than the second group. And Tolman and his colleagues concluded from this that it's easier for animals like rats to code spatial information about the environment specifically, in terms of places rather than in terms of sequences of movement or like these linked chains of actions. Now Tolman interpreted these results to mean that rats must have been representing the layout of the mazes using what he called cognitive maps. Now, cognitive maps are a kind of mental representation. That is, mentally stored information about the environment. And this was big. This is the kind of thing the behaviorist psychologists thought we could not study. We could not study unobservable mental states. But Tolman and his colleagues showed that we can study unobservable mental states. Not only that, we need to posit that there are such mental states in order to explain some of the results we observe in experiments like the ones that Tolman and his colleagues conducted. All right, so Edward Tolman's experimental results suggested that the behaviorist idea of spatial learning in rats being explained by linking together chains of different responses that were learned as a result of conditioning may not be the best way to understand how spatial learning works in rats. And the psychologist Karl Lashley actually took this a bit further in a 1951 essay where he made the more general argument that this is actually a poor way to understand many kinds of complex behavior, not just spatial learning in rats. For example, think of language. It's hard to explain language using a behaviorist approach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, once we get to the work of Noam Chomsky. But Lashley's paper also contains two other very important ideas. the hypothesis of subconscious information processing, and the hypothesis of task analysis. Subconscious information processing is obviously an idea that goes a lot further back than Lashley, but he pointed out that the execution of a lot of complex behavior is actually handled unconsciously. Many of the information processing systems that we rely on to do things as simple as open doors or pick up coffee cups operate below the threshold of our conscious awareness. And that's become a very important idea in cognitive science, is that a lot of information processing actually occurs unconsciously rather than consciously. Another important idea is that of task analysis, and that is this idea that we can understand a complex task and the system upon which the task is realized, or within which it is realized, by breaking it down into subtasks and subsystems and trying to understand those in a hierarchical manner. So think of memory, for example. We have this faculty memory, but we can break it down into different subtasks like storage and retrieval. And then we can try to understand the systems that are responsible for those subtasks. Similarly, we can talk about different functions of memory, long-term, short-term, working memory, prospective memory, and break it down and try to understand it that way, one bit at a time, as it were. So these are very important ideas that have come to us through Karl Lashley's paper, and which inform a lot of the ways that cognitive scientists approach studying various aspects of the mind and of the mental to this day. All right, so that's it for behaviorism. Let's move on to computation. All right, so around the same time that Edward Tolman and Karl Lashley were questioning these fundamental assumptions of behaviorism, Alan Turing, a computer scientist from the United Kingdom, was helping to lay the foundations for computer science and artificial intelligence. I'll show a picture here of a computer from Alan Turing's day. They're much larger and can do much fewer things than they can today. But as we'll see, computers nowadays are basically, theoretically, pretty much the same as they were when Turing conceived of them. Now, Alan Turing is well known for his work on Project Ultra during the Second World War. This was the initiative to break the Enigma code that was used by German military units to communicate clandestinely with one another. And he's also known for something called the Turing test, which is meant to be a test of whether machines can think. But today I'm going to be examining Turing's efforts to formalize computation. That is, computation is a very important concept in cognitive science, as we'll see now. Indeed, Bermudez here writes on page 13 that computation is what computers do, and according to many cognitive scientists, it is what minds do. So minds are like natural computers, according to many cognitive scientists. And Turing's model of computation, which is now known as the Turing Machine, was conceived of to help he and his colleagues address a problem that was known as the halting problem, or the decision problem. So what is the halting problem? Well, the halting problem is the problem of determining whether there is a solution or a procedure, determining whether there is a procedure, we'll say, for telling us whether a math problem has a solution. So, for example, you have a computer program that's defined for some inputs but not other inputs. If we had a solution to the halting problem, that would tell this computer programmer whether, given a specific program and a specific type of input, the program is defined for that input. In other words, it would tell us whether there was an answer to that problem, or whether the computer program would deliver an answer, or whether it would continue looping on indefinitely and futilely trying to deliver an answer. And Turing wanted a simple mechanical solution, something like a mathematical formula that he could use to determine whether, given a particular program with certain inputs, there would be a solution that that program could deliver. So to tackle this program, Turing did a number of very important things. He had to make the notion of a mechanical step-by-step procedure more precise. And he did this using the notion of the algorithm. Now, an algorithm is a very old idea. It goes all the way back to the Islamic Golden Age. And basically what an algorithm is an unambiguous set of rules that can be applied to a set of objects to transform them in a definite and circumscribed way. So when it comes to computer science, an algorithm is like a set of instructions that tell the computer what to do in a step-by-step manner. So to tackle the halting problem with his new, more rigorous concept of step-by-step reasoning or step-by-step rules for transforming inputs into outputs, that is the algorithm, Turing conceived of a machine called a Turing machine. Now, the Turing machine is an imaginary machine. Turing never built a Turing machine. But if we did build a Turing machine, it might look a little something like this. Basically, a Turing machine consists of an infinitely long tape, and the tape has cells in it onto which symbols can be written or deleted. It has a machine head which can move the tape one cell at a time to the right or the left, and it can delete cells, it can type symbols onto the cells, so on and so forth. It has a display window so that the operator can see the state that the machine is in. And it has a machine table, which is like the computer program, essentially. It's a set of instructions for the Turing machine. So that's like its computer program. Now, the importance of the Turing machine here, especially when it comes to the halting problem, is like this. A Turing machine is an example of a discrete state machine. That means it's a machine that can only be in one state at a time, right? It's either in state A, state B, or state C, so on and so forth. One state at a time. Moreover, its behavior is completely determined by the machine's current state, the machine table, and the symbols that are on the tape. So even though Turing machines are imaginary, they gave Turing a way to give a mechanistic account of algorithms and to address the halting problem. Since the machine states can all be represented by sequences of numbers, for example, this allowed Alan Turing to generate mathematical proofs about Turing machines, even though he never actually built one. They were just mathematical objects for him. Nonetheless, he could derive proofs about them. And by doing this, he was able to show, firstly, that there was no solution to the halting problem. So we cannot know, given a certain program and a certain set of inputs, there's no procedure to determine whether that program, given those inputs, will deliver a certain output or just continue on forever to infinity. But he also proved that there's a special type of Turing machine called a universal Turing machine that can run any specialized Turing machine. And that's basically the theoretical precursor to all modern computers, all modern digital computers. So in other words, if I have a Turing machine that's dedicated specifically to addition and subtraction, okay, I can implement that Turing machine on a universal Turing machine. If I have a Turing machine that's meant for multiplication and division, I can implement that Turing machine on a universal Turing machine, so on and so forth. And finally, Turing helped to articulate what is called the Church-Turing thesis. It's named after Alonzo Church, who was actually Alan Turing's doctoral supervisor. So Turing's work, along with that of Alonzo Church, showed that any mathematical problem that can be solved algorithmically can also be solved by a Turing machine. So any computable problem can be solved by a Turing machine. And if of course this is right, then that means, as I mentioned earlier, all modern digital computers are essentially universal Turing machines. So this is very important because Alan Turing's work not only provided the theoretical basis for computers, which we now rely on, it also provided a basis for understanding cognition, that is thinking, as computation. That is the rule-governed transformation of representations into other representations. That is the algorithmic transformation of inputs into outputs. This work was so important, I don't think that even Turing himself grasped what he had done with this work. Later on, he published a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, where he asks whether machines can think and proposes the Turing test as an answer to this question. But if you're a computationalist, that is, if you subscribe to the computational representational theory of mind, on which cognition is computation, it is the rule-governed transformation of representations into other representations, then of course machines can think. Of course computers can think, because they compute, and that's just what cognition is. And that's what we're doing too, if you're a computationalist. So that is to say, Turing didn't need to posit the Turing test to answer this question, can machines think? He had essentially answered that question with his earlier work on the decision problem, or the halting problem. People soon began to think of cognition in terms of information processing, and his work on computation gave cognitive scientists the means to formalize these notions like computation, algorithm, information processing, mental representation, and so on and so forth. Okay, so far we've seen the decline of behaviorism and the importance of mental representations, and we've talked about Alan Turing's work and how that is important when it comes to formalizing ideas like computation, the algorithm, and cognition as information processing. Let's now turn to linguistics. All right, so some of the very same themes that we just encountered in Alan Turing's work also appear in the field of linguistics, starting around the middle of the 21st century. For example, the idea of transformational grammar, proposed by the linguist Noam Chomsky, allows us to study language in a kind of algorithmic way, just in a similar way that Turing was able to make sense of computation in an algorithmic way. So before Noam Chomsky, linguistics was largely limited to describing and classifying how different languages work. But Chomsky's book, Syntactic Structures, which was published in 1957, is regarded by linguists and cognitive scientists in general as the very first to attempt to explain why languages work the way they do, as opposed to simply how different languages work. Now, Chomsky is also important because his review of B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, was, together with the work of people like Tolman, another kind of nail in the coffin for behaviorism. Chomsky basically pointed out that language cannot be a matter of association and reinforcement because children learn language much too quickly for it to be a matter of some kind of learned response to the environment. Chomsky basically thought that there must be innate, if not innate knowledge, innate mechanisms that allowed us to learn natural languages as quickly as we do. So think back to the rationalist empiricist debate, if you like. In any case, so Chomsky introduced this idea of transformational grammar, and that's what I'll talk about today. Perhaps I'll do another video down the road on universal grammar, which is another thing that Chomsky's known for. But in any case, Chomsky distinguishes between what he calls deep structure and surface structure of a language. So a deep structure is phrase structure grammar, rules that specify how a sentence is built up. Surface structure, on the other hand, is just how the words in a sentence are organized. And we can analyze the phrase structure or the deep structure of a sentence with phrase structure trees like this one that I'll show here. So here we have a sentence, John has hit the ball, and we can analyze it in terms of, the whole sentence, or noun phrases and verb phrases and particular verbs and articles and nouns and all of that nice stuff. So some sentences, like the one we just looked at, together with another sentence, like the ball has been hit by John. So John has hit the ball and the ball has been hit by John, have different phrase structures, but they have very similar meanings. Some sentences have similar structures, but very different meanings. So for example, Susan is easy to please versus Susan is eager to please. This sentence, or these two sentences, only differ by a couple of letters, and yet they mean very different things. So they have very similar surface structure, but different meanings. What transformational grammar aims to do is provide a rule-based or algorithmic account of the similarities between sentences in the first example, John has hit the ball and the ball has been hit by John, and the differences between sentences in the second example, Susan is easy to please versus Susan is eager to please. So linguists like Noam Chomsky do this by analyzing phrase structure to try to identify rules for acceptably transforming the deep structure of a sentence. And the key here is that this is all very algorithmic, just like Turing's work on computation, right? So for example, what Chomsky's really trying to do here is identify algorithms for acceptably transforming one string of symbols into another string of symbols in a systematic, rule-governed kind of way. So let's take an example. Imagine we wanted to transform an active sentence into a passive sentence. So we want to transform John has hit the ball into the ball has been hit by John. Well, we can take our first noun phrase, our auxiliary, our verb, our second noun phrase, that's our first sentence, and we want to turn it into the second sentence, which involves adding the word been and the word by in a particular way to the sentence. I'll show you the exact transformation here. But in any case, what this will do is turn the first sentence into the second sentence in a systematic, rule-governed way. And that's the kind of thing that Chomsky's trying to do by studying transformational grammar, is identify these algorithmic, systematic rules that allow us to acceptably transform the deep structure or phrase structure of sentences. Another key theme here takes us back to Karl Lashley's work, right? The hierarchical organization of behavior. The structure of natural language, that is, languages that people speak, is also hierarchical. Likewise with speaking a language and understanding a language. So speaking and understanding involve grasping these structures which are hierarchical themselves. And again, a lot of this happens below the threshold of conscious awareness. So understanding the rules of transformational grammar requires us to study language in a hierarchical way. And you can even see this in the phrase structure trees that I posted here. They're hierarchical. We move from the level of the whole sentence down to particular parts of the sentence. And just to reiterate the importance not just of this hierarchical organization, but also the unconscious nature of this information processing. If you're a native speaker of English, that is, if English is your first language, just try to not understand what someone is telling you the next time you hear a sentence in English. You can't do it. It's unconscious and automatic. Just goes to show you how much of this information processing takes place below the threshold of conscious awareness. All right, so that's all I want to say about linguistics for now. Let's go back to psychology for a moment. Right, so after behaviorism began to decline, psychologists started talking about cognition in terms of information processing, rather than in terms of conditioning or association and reinforcement. And one of the important influences here, besides the work of people like Edward Tolman, was work that was going on within an area called information theory. In particular, an important idea is the idea that information can actually be measured. Now, information theory is an area of mathematics, and it began with Claude Shannon's paper entitled A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which was published in 1948. Shannon is now known as the father of information theory, rather like Turing is known as the father of computer science. And like Alan Turing, Shannon's work as a cryptographer was very important during the Second World War. His master's thesis also dealt with the design of electronic circuits, and he showed that we can use circuits to implement any logical or numerical relationship. So his work is very much in the same vein as Alan Turing's. And he discusses how we can measure information. We can measure it with a fundamental unit called a bit. And a bit is short for binary digit. So we've all heard of bits and bytes and megabits and metabytes and gigabytes and all of that stuff. Well, the most fundamental unit of those is a bit, a binary digit, and it's used to measure information. So one bit is the uncertainty of a binary random variable. Our variable is either 0 or 1 with equal probability. So bits are binary because they can only have one of two values, true or false, on or off, 0 or 1. That's why they're binary digits, 0 or 1, right? So this was an important idea because, well, if psychologists were going to talk about cognition in terms of information processing, well, obviously we need a way to measure information, and Claude Shannon provided a way to measure information. And psychologists like George Miller, who were among the early, what we call cognitive psychologists, rather than behaviorist psychologists, began to apply these principles to help study the mind. So George Miller was interested in the information processing capacities of our sense modalities, that is our senses, our sensory system, so vision, audition, olfaction, those kinds of things. And Miller used this concept that is known as an information channel to help establish the limits of our sense modalities. In other words, how much information can flow through the information processing channels that subserve our vision or our hearing or that kind of thing. So an information channel is simply a medium through which information can travel. So, for our purposes, we're talking about our sense modalities, but other things count as information channels too, like radio frequencies, television frequencies, cables through which information travels. These are all information channels, and so are our sensory systems, according to Miller. So in 1956, Miller published a paper in which he drew attention to all of the different ranges, this wide range of evidence, which suggested that our capacity, our channel capacity, at least when it comes to our sense modalities for receiving and transmitting information, is somewhat limited. Miller's article actually shows that we're limited, especially in terms of the kinds of absolute judgments that we can make. So an absolute judgment is like making a judgment or naming the value of something without a reference. So for example, think of the difference between perfect pitch and relative pitch. So perfect pitch, or as it's technically known, absolute pitch, is the ability to name a pitch, name a note, C, D, B flat, F sharp, whatever. It's the ability to name this pitch without a reference tone. Not many people have absolute pitch. It's estimated that probably 1 in 10,000 people has absolute pitch. We're all much better at making absolute color judgments, in fact. We can look at a red object and name, oh, that's a red object, without a reference object, right? But we're not as good at that with making absolute pitch judgments. But we can get pretty good at relative pitch judgments, you know, telling which pitch is higher than another pitch, or when it comes to color, which color is lighter or darker. We're pretty good at relative judgments, but with absolute judgments, we're not really very good at that kind of stuff. So in one of the experiments that Miller did, he had participants listen to tones, so different musical notes, and the tones were assigned numbers. So let's say I play the tones C, E, and F sharp. I'll assign those the numbers 1, 2, and 3, respectively. So if you heard a sequence like E, C, C, F sharp, E, you'd have to respond by saying 2, 1, 1, 3, 2, or by pushing the corresponding buttons, or something like that. Now, Miller reported in this article that when the sequences of tones are very short, like 1 or 2 tones long, participants never made any mistakes. But when the sequences of tones was 6 tones or longer, the participants' performance at this task actually declined dramatically. And similar phenomena have been found to occur in other modalities like vision. So what exactly is going on here? Well, Miller reasoned that what's going on is that our perceptual systems are information channels that have roughly the same channel capacity. In other words, they have the same limited amount of information, the same limits to the amount of information processed, or information that they can transmit. So what Miller's proposing here is basically an information processing bottleneck for our perceptual systems. What is the limit? What is the size of this bottleneck? Well, Miller thought that it was about 7 items, plus or minus 2. And indeed, the title of his paper reflects this. It's called The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2. And without getting into the math, that basically means that the information capacity of these information channels, of our sense modalities, is about 3 bits. So that's not a lot of information. So how is it that we can even make the judgments that we do? I mean, granted, we're not very good at making absolute judgments, but with such a small amount of information that can travel through our sense modalities at any one time, how is it that we're able to even do as well as we do, given these limits? Well, one solution is called chunking. This is a way that we can work around the channel capacity of our perceptual systems. And basically, when we chunk information, we're reorganizing it so that it's easier to process. So, you know, think of using different kinds of mathematical notation. I mean, the number 1100100 is hard to work with. That's binary notation for the number 100. But if we use decimal notation, 100 is just 100. It's the same number, the same quantity being represented, but it's being represented in a way that's easier to work with in decimal notation as opposed to in binary notation. Or probably the best example of chunking is phone numbers. I mean, hardly anyone commits phone numbers to memory nowadays because we all have smartphones and all of that. But when you commit a phone number to memory, you tend to chunk it. You might chunk the area code, and then the first 3 digits, and then the last 4 digits, so that you're not trying to remember, you know, a string of numbers that's 10 or 11 digits long. Instead, you're remembering 3 chunks of 3 to 4 numbers, which is a lot easier to work with. So that's chunking. All right, so Miller had established that there is an information processing bottleneck on our perceptual systems, that the information processing capacity of our perceptual systems is limited. But he didn't say much about the specific ways that our sense modalities or our information processing channels actually do the information processing. For that, we're going to turn next to the work of another early cognitive psychologist, Donald Broadbent. All right, so in 1958, Donald Broadbent developed a number of different early models to explain how all of our perceptual systems work in his book, Perception and Communication. And we're only going to look at one of those models today. But before we do, I want you to consider something called the cocktail party phenomenon. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what this is, even if you haven't heard the name. The cocktail party phenomenon highlights something called selective attention. So you're at a cocktail party. There's all kinds of voices that you're hearing around you, all these different conversations that you're hearing. And somehow your mind manages to zero in on a particular conversation and filter out everything else. How does something like that work? How does selective attention work in a big noisy environment like a cocktail party? Well, selective attention occurs in all of our sense modalities, but Broadbent was particularly interested in understanding how it worked within the context of audition, so auditory attention, basically hearing, like in the cocktail party phenomenon. And he used what are called dichotic listening experiments to try to study this. So dichotic listening experiments are experiments where experimental participants are presented with different auditory stimuli in each ear. So they'll be wearing headphones and they'll hear something different in one ear versus the other ear, and they'll be asked to report something about what they heard as part of the experiment. In this case, short strings of numbers or letters were played in each ear through headphones. Different strings are played to each ear simultaneously. And Broadbent's participants performed the best at responding to, recalling and reporting what strings they heard when they had to report the stimuli ear by ear. So perhaps there was, that was due to managing that selective attention. That may have been the way the participants directed their attention or selected what stimuli to attend to in order to improve their recall. And by doing experiments like this, Broadbent was able to develop an information processing model like this one here of selective attention, where we have information coming in from the senses to a short-term memory store and then to a selective filter. From there, it moves on to some perceptual system, in this case the auditory system, which then pumps information through to perhaps a store of probabilities of past events, and then to a system for varying behavioral output until some input is secured. And this all is basically a roundabout way of saying that information is filtered and then put to use, either say, allowing us to select a particular stimulus to home in on or something like that, to detect the voice of somebody that we want to talk to and go and listen to that conversation versus another conversation. The specifics of how the model works are less important right now in this lecture than the fact that we've been able to develop models like this that explain how information flows through an information processing system. And that has been a very important feature of cognitive science in general, and specifically cognitive psychology as well. All right, so let's round all of this up with a little discussion of all these different points of contact and what it means for studying the mind. So we've taken quite a tour through the early stages of cognitive science from the early 20th century to just past the midpoint of the 20th century. And we haven't really even gotten to the cognitive revolution, at least not the cognitive revolution as it was in full swing. We haven't talked about computational modeling. We haven't really talked about what's called the turn to the brain. As you'll have noticed, we didn't really talk about the brain that much, and that's because at this time, cognitive scientists didn't have very good tools for studying the brain. But in the 1980s, they started using much better technology to study the brain, and perhaps I can do a future lecture on that for this YouTube channel if there are people out there who are interested in that. We haven't talked about other things like the mental imagery wars, or there's any number of things that we could continue talking about. But what's important to emphasize today is the idea of cognition as information processing. So whether we're talking about rats in mazes, or we're talking about picking out particular voices in a crowded room, minds are best understood, at least according to most cognitive scientists, as information processors. So minds are like natural computers, and we can understand how they work by understanding how information flows through those systems, by creating models like Broadbent's model and testing them, perhaps by doing experiments in psychology or making computational models out of them in computer science and artificial intelligence. And of course, if minds and computers are both information processors, well, then the notion of representation and the notion of an algorithm becomes very important as well. Information about the environment is encoded as representation, and we can have lots of different kinds of representations: cognitive maps, phrase structure rules, machine tables. But this idea of a mental representation, and that we can transform representations into other representations in a rule-governed systematic way, that is, algorithmically, has been very important for understanding the mind. So in a nutshell, the modern understanding of the mind, at least according to the computational representational theory of mind, is that the mind is a computer. It's a naturally evolved computer. And that's all I have to say about that for now. So that's been our last full lecture for this class. Phew, we made it. I will be doing one more brief lecture for this class where I will cover some points that I think you'll need to know regarding the final exam. So stay tuned for that. It should be up in a day or two. And until then, I hope you're all continuing to hang in there, and I'll see you next time.